Welcome to the Emerging Civil War podcast. I'm Chris Mikowski, and joining me today from the great city of Fredericksburg, Virginia, is my friend John Launius, National Park Service historian. How are you today, John?
Not too bad. How about you, Chris?
I'm doing well. I'm doing well. And John is the guy I know in all of the historians that I am friends with who knows the most about firearms. It's his passion. And I wanted to bring him on today to talk a little bit about this. Um, Particularly because there are a lot of misconceptions about firearms. And John is going to talk today about the five biggest myths about Civil War firearms. And John, I'm super excited for this discussion because I think it's going to shed a lot of light on some things that confuse a lot of people.
Yeah, absolutely. People when I'm, talking to people, some of the biggest questions that I talk to when I'm working has to do with can often be answered by explaining the limitations of Civil War firearms and other, other technical aspects of the Civil War as well. Where it's like, yeah, fighting the way they fought during the Civil War doesn't make any sense in 2025, but it might actually have made sense in 1865. And so that's at least part of what I'm going to talk about.
Yeah, yeah. So, what got you interested in armaments in particular?
Well, probably the biggest thing for me is I spent 7 years in the U.S. Army, in the National Guard specifically, as an artilleryman. So I was combat arms. I've always had kind of a fascination with the big guns. I was rocket artillery specifically, not tube artillery. So I was flip switch go whoosh rather than pull string go boom. Um, but still very much, the when you're an artilleryman, right, your life is built around that weapon system, right? That is your entire job. And that sort of led to an interest into Civil War artillery. And so I kind of went from big to small, right? So from Civil
Okay.
War artillery to Civil War firearms, or Civil War small arms, excuse me. Um, and in particular, I've really enjoyed. I'm a historic weapons supervisor for the National Park Service, and I've found that being able to talk about the weapons can be a really interesting way to slide into some more minutia of the war that people don't necessarily expect you can do.
Yeah. Now, since you used the phrase big guns, I'm going to have to point out I have my Josh Allen glass here. So that's my
Mm,
big gun that I'm bringing to the conversation today, right?
fair enough.
Yeah. um, so, and as a black powder specialist, as a historic weapons specialist, what are some of the sorts of things that you do for the Park Service in that capacity?
Yeah, so there's a fair amount that goes into being a historic weapons supervisor. So we're certified on a 4-year basis. So every 4 years, we have to go back to a class that the Park Service holds, or we lose that certification. We're responsible for the program management for our park's historic weapons program. So that includes things like managing the powder magazine, ordering, sending in orders for things like powder, weapons maintenance. We have to make when we do historic weapons programs, we have to lay out the program area, make sure that all of the required distances and safety standoffs are applied are adhered to. Um, uh, we're often, not always, but often the person who actually ends up giving the historic weapons program itself, as well, being the primary interpretive voice for those programs. So it requires you to have you a pretty intense knowledge. The Park Service course is 2 weeks long, and it's a full week focused on small arms and then a full week focused on artillery. Um, and even that really only certifies you to deal with the muzzleloading weapons, right? So that covers the muskets and the muzzleloading cannons. You want to do stuff like the carbines or breech loaders. That's an entirely separate process to get certified for those as well. So The Park Service takes that kind of training and safety very, very seriously because, when you're dealing with black powder, there's not that much powder when you fire a musket. I have several of my muskets back here behind me, actually. That can only go so wrong. It can still go plenty wrong, but there's only so much energy actually involved in that incident if things do go wrong. But when you're talking about something like cannon demos, you're talking up sometimes up to a full pound of black powder. That is a lot of energy that can go places you don't want it to go. And so it has to be done very carefully and very safely.
And I'll give you a special shout out because I've seen you do programs at the park and you get the uniform on and you look fantastic, but you have a really good way of interacting with visitors about the uniform, about the armaments, about how the process works. I've had my son Maxwell with me and you did a really neat job of showing him how the bayonet worked. I mean, um, you just have a real talent as an interpreter when it comes to the armaments. So I'll give you a little kudos for
Oh,
that.
well, I appreciate that. Thank you very
Yeah.
much.
Yeah. So you get a lot of questions. So today I thought we would give you the chance to answer the five biggest myths about firearms. So these are probably questions you get a lot. And so here's your chance. So let's start at number five. What do you think is the fifth most important misconception we need to clear up today?
Well, so admittedly, I'm going from kind of pedantic to more relevant, right? So there are a number of misconceptions about Civil War firearms and musketry that really only bother people like me who who have spent way too much time reading about this. And I'm starting with one of those. And the first two are pretty much just those. The next three are a bit, I think, a bit more relevant.
So this qualifies as like a firearm pet peeve. Is that
Pretty
what it was?
much.
Okay. All
Yeah,
right.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So the first one is the idea of the so-called Williams cleaner bullet, which I'm not
Okay.
sure if you've ever heard that
No,
terminology.
I've heard of the cleaner bullet, but I didn't know that some Williams person was associated with it.
Yeah, so the cleaner bullet is they're pretty well known, especially amongst relic hunters, because they tend to be one of the more common bullet types found in army encampment sites. And the name and really the first two myths have to do with a naming misunderstanding that has caused something to be understood in a way that is inaccurate. And the Williams cleaner bullet is one of those. And so I actually have a Williams cleaner bullet here. Now this is not an original. This is a modern recreation of a Williams cleaner bullet made by a company called Paper Cartridges up in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania.
So now
And
walk us through what we're looking at here because it looks a little different than the
it
typical
does. So I
bullets.
have a standard quote unquote mini ball, which I'm also going to get into.
Okay.
And so, anyone who's been to a battlefield or learned about the Civil War has learned about the classic mini ball. It's a big chunk of lead. It kind of looks like a small shotgun slug with the hollow base that expands when the gun is fired, right? That's pretty standard. The Williams bullet works differently. So the Williams bullet it is based on the same basic principle that you're using the energy in the gunpowder to expand the bullet so it catches the rifling, right? That's the core concept behind basically all rifled muskets during this time period. Bullet goes in smaller, comes out bigger, so it catches the rifling and spins and stabilizes like throwing a football or a frisbee. Um, there are multiple different ways that was accomplished, and the Williams bullet is an example of one of the ways that was done, where instead of having a hollow base, this has a small hole in the base with a hardened lead antimony alloy pin that goes in the base with a flat base on the bottom of the pin. And so what happens is two things happen. One, when the gun is loaded and the soldier runs the rammer home, that is going to push that plunger into the base of the bullet a little bit, especially if he rams with some alacrity. Um, More importantly, when the gun is fired and the powder charge goes off, it's going to drive that pin into the base of the bullet and expand it into the rifling so that it catches the rifling. Now, Williams was trying to solve a pretty severe problem that had developed specifically in the context of the American Civil War when he developed this bullet, which was the classic Harper's Ferry bullet, as designed and adopted by the U.S. Army in the lead up to the war, did not expand quickly. It expanded relatively slowly and not always super consistently. Now, that was not a problem before the war started, because the entire US Army is 16,000 men. You don't have that many muskets out there. You don't actually have to make that many bullets. And so the US Army adopts a bullet and rifle combination that has a really tight fitting bullet, right? So a .580 of an inch bore diameter in the musket and a .5775 diameter bullet. So that difference between the size of the bullet and the size of the bore is called the windage. And that difference meant, that very small difference meant that the bullets fit very tightly in the bore, that they didn't have to expand very much upon firing, which means the bullet didn't deform very much when it was fired. And so it fit very tightly in the bore, it expanded properly in the bore, it caught the rifling, it didn't deform very much, and it was very accurate, but it was still relatively cheap and very simple because it was just a single chunk of lead. That becomes a problem when the war starts,
Okay.
because you go from a 16,000 man army to a 600,000 plus man army. And they're not just carrying nicely made pre-war high quality control Springfield muskets. They're carrying Springfield muskets. They're carrying muskets, Springfield pattern muskets made by contractors like Colt and Whitneyville and Remington. They're carrying European muskets, most notably the 1853 pattern Infield, which has a different bore diameter than the Springfield.
Okay.
It has a .5770 bore. So the pre-war U.S. Army bullet will not fit in an Infield rifled musket.
Okay.
So the Army says no big deal. We'll just adopt a smaller bullet, give those to the guys with the infields. Then, of course, before you know it, guys, infield regiments are getting Springfield ammunition, and Springfield units are getting infield ammunition, or at least that's the concern. So the Army downsizes the bullet from 5.775 to 5.76 and then 5.74. That makes sure it fits on all the guns. It also solves some quality control issues. As more and more muskets are being made, bore diameters aren't as consistent anymore, and in particular, bullet diameters aren't as consistent anymore. So if you reduce the standard size of the bullet, it'll fit in all the guns, and some of them are a bit too big, no big deal, it'll still all fit. That becomes a problem because now the relatively slow and inefficient expansion of the standard bullet means the bullet doesn't fully expand into the bore until it's several inches down the barrel. Now, that's not necessarily an accuracy issue, but it does mean that the bullet is not taking the fouling from the previous shots out with it for those first several inches from the breech forward.
And when you're talking about the fouling, you're talking about just sort of the detritus left behind from the
Yeah.
gunpowder and the explosion.
So black powder is an incredibly dirty burning propellant. It leaves all kinds of nasty stuff behind after it burns. That was part of the reason why that rifles had traditionally been kind of a problem in military service, because the more you fire the gun, the more crud gets left in the barrel. Functionally, the smaller the bore diameter gets, the harder it becomes to load. Now, the way that was traditionally solved in smoothbore muskets was that the bullet was just way smaller than the bore. So in U.S. service, for example, we fielded 69 caliber muskets, but the balls were 63 caliber,
Okay.
so a lot smaller. I mean, there was lots of space for gunk to build up in the bore before the gun became difficult to load. Now, with rifles, that bullet at some point has to fit tightly in the bore so it will spin,
Mm-hmm.
which means, I've experienced this myself, and there are plenty of stories of this happening to Civil War soldiers during the war. They're in the middle of a firefight, they've shot 20, 30, 40 rounds, and all of a sudden they can't load their muskets anymore because they get that bullet 20 inches down the barrel, they hit a giant wad of crud in the bore, and the bullet jams. So you find stories of Civil War soldiers taking their muskets and slamming them against trees or rocks, or abandoning muskets that won't load, for the muskets of fallen comrades or of captured muskets from the enemy. Um, there's a really good account from the Third Wisconsin at the Battle of Chancellorsville on May 3rd, where they talk about having fired over 100 rounds of ammunition per man, and how their muskets had become so hot, they could not they could barely hold them. It become so fouled they could barely load them. How some of the muskets have actually become so hot that even if they did get them loaded, the powder charge went off before they finished
Mm.
the loading process. The powder auto ignited in the musket. So Mr. Williams was trying to find a way to create a bullet that would solve this problem, that would be small enough to load really easily in the gun, but expand really effectively, regardless of what gun it was put in. And so he comes up with a series of designs. This is technically a Type 2 Williams,
Okay.
and this is going to be the most common of them. And his idea was, let's create a design that, effectively, once it is expanded into the bullet, is a solid, continuous piece of metal, which is why part of the reason why he designs the pin the way it does. Now, what that means is that the bullet expands instantaneously upon being fired. It's probably, if you ram it aggressively, it's already expanded into the rifling before you've even pulled the trigger, which means the second it starts moving, it is pulling the crud from the previous shots out with it.
Mhm.
Now, that is not specifically his intention. His intention is to create a bullet that loads easier and fires more accurately. That's what he describes his intentions as in his patent. But soldiers pretty quickly realize, but people pretty quickly realize that, hey, you can shoot more of these before the gun becomes fouled than you can these. And
Okay.
so Williams also starts advertising it as a more accurate and cleaner firing bullet.
All right.
So people took the Williams cleaner bullet, which is to say it is cleaner than a Harper's Ferry bullet, and misunderstand it in the years following as a cleaner bullet that is designed to clean the gun.
Gotcha. Gotcha. All
And I
right.
and I have heard this from people that say that, they will. I have heard people say that the reason you find so many of these cleaner bullets left behind by Civil War soldiers is because they knew they were not meant to kill someone; they were meant to clean the gun instead. Totally opposite from what Williams was trying to do. I have had people look me dead in the face. People who have been black powder shooters for longer than I've been alive look me straight in the face and say that these had super small powder charges and would just bloop out of the barrel and fall in front of the soldier without going any appreciable distance.
Uh-huh.
Um, when what Williams was really trying to do, he was trying to design a better combat bullet, and arguably he absolutely did.
So it could be like Williams' more effective bullet,
Right.
but
Would be it doesn't come off the tongue quite as nicely. Um, Now, you will find a whole bunch of these laying around especially in winter encampment areas. Um, and that's been an open question for why. Well, there's probably a couple of reasons why. One, in 1864, a bunch of Type 3 Williams bullets are sent out to Sherman's army for testing. He does a bunch of testing. He comes back with a report that says these bullets damage the bores of the guns.
mm,
How he determined that, I have no idea. But one of the things that is missing on this version of the Williams bullet that you would see in real ones is there should be a concave zinc disc in between the bullet and the plunger.
okay.
And that zinc disc was designed to be pushed up around the edges of the bullet to help engage the rifling. And a lot of Williams' competitors, who were also trying to get big army contracts for their improved bullet designs, claimed that zinc, which was of course harder than the lead, damaged the rifling in the gun bores.
So they're really just smack talking the competition.
There's smack talk in the competition.
Okay.
Um, Now, there was a legitimate problem with the Type 3 Williams bullets. The Type 3 Williams bullets were a lot lighter. Williams specifically sold them as being about 200 grains or about a third lighter than the standard bullet. And his argument to the government was that these are much lighter bullets. They will cost, it'll cost you less lead, but they're just as effective, so that the government will save money for every Reb they kill. Um, the problem was that he made the bullet so lightly constructed and to get it to that point that the bullet tended to blow out when fired.
Oh,
Is the skirt would basically break off and or the hardened pin would be driven through the bullet,
oh, okay.
which was a problem, which was an established problem with this style of expanding bullet that used a separate component to expand the bullet. Is that every now and again that separate component just gets blown through the soft lead bullet rather than expanding it.
So you do need to have some sort of bullet integrity in order for the bullet to work, and so having it just sort of disintegrate really defeats the purpose.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so the Type 3 Williams bullet was legitimately a problem. Those are the ones that are sent out to Sherman. They're a total failure. The other problem is that by the time 1864 rolls around, Williams is dead. And is no longer able to advocate for his own invention. And there's also a change in the U.S. Army Ordnance Department. The U.S. Army Master of Ordnance changes in 1864, and the new guy doesn't like the Williams bullet and has it totally withdrawn from service, which is interesting because the guy before him had actually been trying to get the U.S. Army to universally transition to the Williams bullet.
Okay.
Um, Now, part of the confusion, probably for why this idea that the Williams is a cleaner bullet comes from as well, is that they were issued in a limited number of shots per arsenal pack. So soldiers were issued their ammunition in 10-round arsenal packs. When the Williams bullet is introduced, it's 2 Williams bullets per pack, and then 4 Williams bullets per pack, and then 6 Williams bullets per pack, and then the last order is 10 Williams bullets per pack. And then that order is reversed to no Williams bullets per pack
Ah,
by 1864. And so they were also packaged differently. Let me see if I can find one of my completed bullets. Here we go. So this is what a normal cartridge would look like. It's a big brown paper tube, right, with your bullet and your powder in it. Williams bullets were almost always packaged in colored paper like this.
okay.
They were easy to differentiate from the rest. So one possible reason Civil War soldiers started dumping them was because there are these reports that come out in 1864 that they're garbage, that they blow out, they damage the rifling of the guns, and they don't want to risk that. The other reason too, at least one theory, is that because they would partially expand when they were loaded, if you're on picket duty and you go to load your musket and you put a Williams bullet in it and you ram a little bit too hard, you're not getting that bullet back out anymore.
Okay.
Only way to get that bullet out easily is to shoot it. And now
Got it.
you've got to clean your gun, and you got to make sure that nobody thinks you're shooting at the enemy and accidentally set off the alarm. So Civil War soldiers may have dumped these so they didn't accidentally load them on picket duty. That's
Okay.
that's admittedly a guess. We don't know that one for sure. But
Okay.
the Williams bullet, unfortunately, they loaded very easily. They were smaller than the standard ordnance bullet. I've I've shot 40 or 50 of these in a row in my muskets with zero issues loading. They load real smooth. They keep the bore clean. They really legit. They're very accurate. They legitimately are just a better bullet, but they fall to the wayside and have been misunderstood as this bullet included in the arsenal packs as a combat cleaning round, which was never Williams' intention. So if anyone
Uh,
ever tells you that, you can know what's going on.
Now we know the story. All right.
Now
So
you know
now,
the story.
so now we're up to number four, which, as you suggested earlier, is also maybe a more pedantic naming related issue, but
It
something
is,
that's probably
yeah.
still common. All right.
So, what do you call this, right? What is this bullet called?
So I would call it a mini ball.
You're right, but you're also wrong.
Right.
which is why this is super pedantic, right? Soldiers called these mini balls, these were popularly known as mini balls. But from a super technical standpoint, they're not mini balls because the true mini ball was the bullet designed. Let me pull up his, let me pull up his name so I don't get his name wrong. Claude Etienne Minier,
Minier, yep.
right? A French army officer. He retires as a colonel. He's the guy who building off of successful designs by French predecessors, comes up with this idea of the self-expanding bullet. The French had been experimenting with rifle muskets for a while. All their previous experiments had involved bullets that used some kind of mechanism within the musket itself to generate the expansion. Minier's idea is to integrate that mechanism into the bullet. And his idea is not too dissimilar from what Williams did, though it's a predecessor to it. His idea is a lead bullet with a hollow base with an iron cup placed in the base, so that
Okay.
when the gun is fired, that iron cup is driven forward, expands the bullet, catches the rifling. That is Minier's design. That is the design that is adopted by the British in their pattern 1851 Minier rifle, which they use very effectively during the Crimean War. And that is with a couple exceptions, the general design adopted throughout Europe. The two-piece bullet with some kind of cup or plunger in the base.
Now, would there be like an adhesive that would hold it in there, or just as they're
Just the
packing the?
friction.
Okay, okay,
It was a friction fit.
okay.
Um, the the French pretty much stuck with that iron cup design throughout the rifled musket era. The British started with the rifled cup design. They ultimately found the iron cup design lacking because that cup was not always driven symmetrically into the base of the bullet. So as the bullet spun, it would be gyroscopically unstable.
Okay.
That iron cup also had a much more the similar tendency to just blow straight through the bullet
Right.
and leave a lead skirt in the gun, which made it pretty hard to load and shoot at that the next time. So the Brits ultimately adopt clay or wood-based cups or plungers in their bullets that they use throughout the 1850s and 60s. Um, that design is not what is used by the U.S. Army as the standard. Um, the James H. Burton is the acting or what was he? What was his actual position? His acting master armorer at Harper's Ferry Arsenal in 1849. When all of this development in Europe is happening, the U.S. Army very rapidly realizes, hey, this is the future, at least in the short term,
Mhm.
of infantry weapons. We don't want to be left behind. So Mr. Burton, do a study, collect collect examples from Europe, figure out what works, what doesn't work, come up with something that will work for us. And Burton looks at the options and decides he doesn't like the way the Europeans are doing it. Um, and for a couple of reasons. One, those two-part bullets are more expensive.
All right.
All right, there's two parts, two different materials. They're more expensive to manufacture. Two, he also doesn't like the way the Europeans are building their ammunition. So this is a European or specifically an infield style cartridge. So this was uh, designed to be used very differently. There's five different pieces of paper in here, three different types of paper. The cartridge is stiffened. The bullet is actually upside down in the cartridge at the bottom here. The bullet is wrapped in a paper patch that is saturated with the lubricant to keep the powder fouling soft. Um, he didn't like that either, at least not at the time, because this is complicated, this is expensive, and the paper patching doesn't always separate from the bullet cleanly, which can leave a little bits of trailing paper on the bullet that can make it do crazy things as it flies. So he wants something that is cheaper, that is easier to make, and that is more consistently accurate. And so he designs what becomes known in US service as the mini ball, what is probably more what a lot of historic weapons pedantics like me are more likely to call a Burton ball, which
Okay.
is the single piece soft lead bullet with the thin hollow skirt, wrapped in a simple paper tube, where the lubricant is carried on the outside of the bullet rather than on the paper of the cartridge tube. And again, for those listening to the podcast rather than watching the video, just to describe the infield style cartridge, it's a white paper tube, about 2.5 and 3 inches long, with a that's been stiffened so that it's very easy to tear and open. And this is a much easier cartridge to use as the soldier, but it's much more complicated to manufacture from an industrial standpoint.
Now, I think it's interesting because you said like a lot of this development, happening in what, like 1849, and so into the early 50s. So this is even before the Civil War comes. So as he's looking for something that's cheaper and easier to manufacture, I mean that has huge ramifications when you're then creating millions of bullets in a mass production capacity,
Absolutely,
because it looks like
absolutely.
these cartridges you're showing are pretty labor intensive to create, and just lots of issues if you were to scale that up.
Yeah, absolutely. And the 1855 pattern cartridge that is adopted by the U.S. Army when they adopt a rifled musket and Burton's bullet design, even itself ends up being too complicated for the mass manufacture of the Civil War.
Yeah.
Um, so the 1855 style cartridge, has three different pieces of paper, two different types of paper. One of them is stiffened to give the cartridge more structure. Each of the three pieces of paper are different sizes from each other. And so in 1862, the U.S. Army simplifies that manufacture even more. The 1862 ordnance pattern cartridge is two pieces of paper, same type of paper, same size patterns. So you just cut two pieces of paper, roll them in the tubes, bullet goes in one, powder goes in the other, stick them together, fold it over, and you're done. Um, and so it's a less robust cartridge. It is slower to use as the soldier, because one of the big advantages of the European style cartridge is you don't actually take the bullet out of the cartridge to load.
Oh,
You
okay.
simply stick the cartridge in. You tear it open for the powder, stick the cartridge in the gun until you have put the bullet fully inside, and then snap the powder cylinder off the top of the bullet.
Oh, okay.
Very easy, very fast to use. With the US style cartridges, you have to bite it open, tear it open, especially the 1862 pattern cartridge, because the powder cylinder is not stiffened. It's hard to get a clean tear on the cartridge. So the powder doesn't always pour very smoothly out of the cartridge into the gun. You might not get all the powder out of the cartridge and into the gun. And then you have to crack the cartridge open in half to actually get the bullet out. And then you have to extricate the bullet from the cartridge and then put that in the gun. So it's a simpler, cheaper cartridge to make, but it's harder to use in the field. And it's especially harder to load quickly.
Yeah. So the mini ball or the minier ball is really a Burton ball, and it's not a ball at all either.
No, it's not a ball. This is something that confuses people to this day, and that standard military, like the standard military cartridge, in the U in most military services, is called the ball cartridge. And we haven't been using spherical balls for a long time. Um, the One of my favorite pictures is actually some of Burton's own drawings, of the that he generates, um, when he's doing this work, and he calls it the yeah the new rifle musket ball, or the expanding elongated conical ball. It's like, cones and balls are different things. Those are not the same thing. Um, but that is one of the things that can be so weird about military terminology, is that these words the certain words have end up becoming stand-ins for more general concepts, and then divorced from their classical dictionary definition in a number of cases. So hyper pedantic thing number two. with relatively few exceptions, no one in the Civil War is shooting minier balls or even mini balls. They're
Okay.
shooting, for the most part, Burton balls.
Burton, conical, grooved.
Yeah. Now, you do have a lot of Confederate soldiers actually issued infield style ammunition because it's being manufactured by contractors in England and then run through the blockade.
Right.
One of the funny ironies of Burton. Burton is the guy who is in charge of adopting what becomes the standard U.S. Army bullet. He's the one who at least in part leads the charge in deciding that the European style cartridge is too complicated and unnecessary. He leaves the army when the war starts, and he works for the Confederate Ordnance Corps.
Huh?
And he tries to get the Confederate Army to standardize on infield style ammunition. So he does a total reversal,
Yeah.
in part arguably because by that point he comes to recognize that in field service, this is actually a superior cartridge for the European style cartridge is a superior cartridge from the standpoint of use by the soldier,
Yeah.
if not necessarily by manufacture by the country.
Yeah. All right. So we're up to number three,
Okay,
our
up to
third
number
biggest
three,
myth.
we're starting to get into some stuff that actually matters a little bit more now.
Okay. Okay.
And I'm actually gonna slide a little from firearms away a little bit and talk instead about bayonets.
Oh, okay. Very good.
Because if there's one thing I hear all the time is that, boy, Civil War generals must have been dumb because they really liked bayonet charges. And how stupid is it to get a bunch of guys set up in a line with with spikes on the end of their guns and run at an enemy with rifles? Boy, they must have been dumb. Um, and I think part of what's going on there is a misunderstanding of what the bayonet was, how it was supposed to be used, and how it was actually supposed to work, both in theory and in practice. Um, and ultimately, and it also grossly overestimates the ability of a Civil War soldier to drive an enemy away exclusively with rifle fire.
Yeah.
Right? At the end of the day, how do you win a battle? You win a battle by getting the enemy to leave the spot they're holding, or by putting them in a situation where they can't leave, but by staying, they are guaranteed to die, so they surrender. Right? At the end of the day, it's about taking ground. Um, and the Civil War armies, for reasons I'm actually going to talk about next, for the last two ones, the effectiveness of Civil War rifle fire is much lower than we tend to imagine. Because again, we filter Civil War combat through, popular media as much as anything else. And while I love the film Gettysburg. I've got a soft spot for the film Gettysburg. Glory is an amazing film. There just isn't that much popular media depicting Civil War combat. So people tend to filter Civil War combat through, World War One or World War Two movies or even modern movies where like the way you defeat the enemy is by shooting them, right?
In all those movies, they have machine guns,
In all
which
those
are
movies, they have
putting a lot
machine
of limit.
guns and repeating rifles or semi-automatic self-loading rifles, and so the firepower of a World War One or World War Two or modern infantry squad is orders of magnitude greater than the Civil War equivalent, or even a Civil War company. Um, and the simple reality is that when the rifled musket is developed first in France and then heavily adopted by the British, there are a lot of very smart European military theorists who are guys who have seen a lot of combat, who at least temporarily begin to think, okay, this is going to fundamentally change the way we fight wars. We'll be able to outrange artillery with these rifled muskets. This will render things like the cavalry charge and the bayonet charge irrelevant. And then the Second War of Italian Independence happens and the Crimean War happens. And in practice, what they find is that yes, the rifled musket in certain circumstances can render horrible attrition against an enemy at range. Um, but in many cases, the winning the day still required the infantry to close with the enemy, right? To get closer and to get well within, the maximum range of a rifle musket. You're never going to defeat the enemy by sitting 500 yards away and picking him off with rifle fire. You can whittle him down that way, but he's never going to leave a position exclusively because of that.
Right. Because he's also whittling you down at the same time.
If he's any
Reinforcements might be
good,
coming. Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah. So,
So the the general understanding continues to be that there's a lovely quote from a Napoleonic era Russian general whose name I'm blanking out on now, but I'm sure people watching will probably know who I'm talking about when I give this quote if they've read him, where he has this wonderful quote that translated to English means, "The bullet is a mad thing. Only the bayonet knows what it is about." Um, and what he's expressing there is this idea that because of the relatively low volume of fire, certainly compared to by modern standards, that smoothbore muskets or rifle muskets are able to produce, well-drilled, well-disciplined troops are shockingly good at just standing there and getting shot at.
mm,
Um, but it takes the most disciplined, the most well-seasoned, the most hardened troops to sit there and receive a bayonet attack,
right.
right?
There's a terror to it.
There is a there is a primal part of the human lizard brain, right? That looks at something that is long and sharp and pointy and instinctively knows that that is going to do seriously bad things to my body if I let it get close enough. Um, there's a visual element, there's a morale element to that was heavily appreciated at the time. Um, that is less appreciated today, in part because it's less necessary. Um, in some ways, this is the same attitude that the French bring with them into World War One that ends up so disastrously for them because of things like the machine gun, but those aren't around yet. Um, so the standard, so the even the British in the Crimean War, and especially the French in the Crimean War, are finding even with long-range rifled artillery and rifled muskets spreading throughout the force, is that a lot of the time you still have to close with the bayonet to drive the enemy from the land the ground you're trying to take. Um, it's kind of like the old stories of the Greeks throwing beehives on the ships of enemy of enemy navies in the Mediterranean, where that a man might stand there and let himself get hacked away with a sword, but as soon as there's a single bee chasing him around, he is jumping off that boat, right? There's something instinctual about the idea of getting stabbed that just doesn't translate to rifle fire from a distance. It's less personal, it's less present, it's less it's just, especially at the rates of fire available to armies in the period, it's just less likely to drive someone from a position.
Yeah. And if we think about the kind of the standard 3 rounds a minute, if you're well trained, well drilled, everything's going okay, you're not getting shot at, but you put someone in a live fire situation where they are being shot at, there's a lot of pressure, guys are going down around you. So your rate of fire is certainly going to be impacted by that. But then suddenly you have someone charging at you with these bayonets. Um, your ability to keep up your rate of fire to be effectively protective is got to plummet to zero pretty quickly.
And actually, that's my next. That's you're getting ahead of me, because that's actually one of the next things I'm going to talk about was
Okay, okay.
is rate of fire.
Yeah.
But you're exactly right, and so there's a reason why, like, as I know, you are a fan of Stonewall Jackson. He is one of the, at least from a tactical standpoint, one of the most effective generals of the war. He places a lot of emphasis on the use of the bayonet, because he understands how it's supposed to be used and how effective it can be when it's used well. Part of the problem you have with bayonet use in the Civil War, well, so one, people assume that you're actually supposed to stab someone with your bayonet. If your bayonet charge works, you never stab anyone,
Right.
right? 'Cause the guy you're the guy you're potentially stabbing is gone long before you get there. That is a successful bayonet charge. Um, Now I mentioned right how much discipline it took for a an infantry force to receive a bayonet attack. Well, it required almost as much discipline to execute one. And that, as much as anything else, is where things begin to fall down with bayonet use in the Civil War. It's not that the bayonet charge is a bad idea inherently in this time period. It's that they're not always used well. The specific formations that officers are supposed to use to maximize the effectiveness of a bayonet charge are often more complicated formations that are more difficult to execute, especially with a citizen soldier army that is comparatively, especially compared to things like the British, less well trained and less well disciplined. And so you see bayonet attacks charges that happen that fail as much because the soldiers who are launching the attack aren't disciplined enough to carry the attack through its conclusion, or don't have the training to execute on the maneuvers and formations that would maximize the likelihood of that attack succeeding in the specific context of the Civil War. And probably one of the best examples of a bayonet charge that goes exactly the way it's supposed to, using the kind of formations that the U.S. Army manuals say you're supposed to do them with, is Upton's charge at the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse,
Right.
where that is a classic example of how a bayonet charge is supposed to happen, where you have a a a column formation built like a hammer, finding a weak spot in the enemy line and smashing straight through it, right? That is a bayonet charge that goes exactly as it is supposed to. And of course, ultimately, Upton's attack at Spotsylvania fails for other reasons, for lack of additional support, um, failure to necessarily properly expand the breach once the breakthrough comes in. Again, that comes down to discipline and training issues within both the U.S. and the Confederate armies more generally. But Upton's attack, if anything else, proves that if your officers are paying attention, if the topography is right, and you've got the right men who just refuse to stop, they still work.
Yeah, yeah, and that was one of those things where Upton even had his guys in the lead elements take their percussion caps off so they wouldn't be tempted to stop. Because I think that's one of those psychological things. If someone's shooting at you, you're inclined to stop and shoot them back, but then
Yeah.
that ruins the bayonet charge.
The worst thing you can do during a bayonet charge is stop and shoot at the guys you're charging.
Yeah,
Similar things happened during the Battle of Fredericksburg, where soldiers are ordered to take the percussion caps off their muskets, or even forced to charge with empty muskets, in hopes that their officers can just keep them moving. Now, of course, there are other problems going on at Fredericksburg
sure.
that have a lot to do with the topography and the setup of the Confederate battle line. Um, but this idea that the bayonet was already obsolete by the time the Civil War starts just isn't. It's we have begun the period where it begins the bayonet begins its slow obsolescence, but it still takes, I would argue, the better part of 100 years from the Civil War before the bayonet has truly become obsolete. I would argue it's really not until you hit the World War II era
Right,
that firearms technology has gotten to the point where the bayonet is now truly a weapon with minimal tactical usefulness.
right. All right. So
So
that was a good one. And are there a lot of bayonet wounds? That's something I hear people ask a lot. Like,
no, there
yeah,
are very few bayonet wounds
because
during the
folks
Civil
get chased
War.
away.
Right. Because again, the most successful version of a bayonet charge means nobody gets stabbed. A failed bayonet charge also means nobody gets stabbed.
Yeah, right.
It's only when a bayonet charge is moderately successful
Yeah,
that
right.
people get stabbed. Which probably the most, at least in our region, the most infamous example of that is the Battle of the Bloody Angle,
Right,
the Battle of
right.
the Mule Shoe, where a charge is successfully carried through to contact, but the guys on the other side stay,
Yeah,
right? And those are things that they're not only rare in the Civil War, they're rare in in this area, this period of warfare period, which is why, at least in theory, when properly executed, a bayonet charge can work because nobody likes to get stabbed.
Right.
It's
Right.
it's just so much easier psychologically to stand there and get shot at because you can see the effect of getting shot at, but you can't see the bullets coming at you. It's hard to miss a bayonet coming at you.
Yeah, yeah. I loved your point about lizard brain reaction to that. So, all right, let's move on to number two, the second
So,
biggest
number two,
misconception. All right.
3 rounds a minute.
Okay, yeah, all right. See, I've already perpetuated that number today.
And I'm guilty of that somewhat myself too. The well, something I think that's interesting is that, at least from what I've seen, nowhere in any of the period manuals is a rate of fire ever dictated.
Mhm.
Um, it's not in Scott's, it's not in Hardy's, it's not in Casey's, where there is an expectation that the evolutions of loading and firing happen within a specific period of time. The goal certainly is to do it as quickly as possible. But from my understanding, this idea of 3 rounds a minute comes from post-war recollections by veterans who they're saying, yeah, the best trained guys could do 3 rounds a minute. Like the guys who were really, really good could do 3 rounds a minute.
Now, see, and as soon as you say that, I'm thinking like, oh yes, and those post-war recollections are always so accurate.
They're always
Like,
perfect, right? Everyone's human memory is infallible. No one's ever wrong about anything. Um, and so as you yourself mentioned, you kind of did it for me a little bit, honestly, is this idea that, like, yeah, if you're on the drill field, you're clean, you're well fed, you're well rested, your musket is well maintained, you've got a well-made musket, your ammunition is all made to the correct ordnance specification. Can you hit 3 rounds a minute? Yeah, I've seen people do it. I've gotten close myself. But as I talked about the issues that are generated because of the mix matching of muskets and bullets and the dirtiness of black powder and the failures in some cases of quality control of both the manufacturing of the guns and the ammunition, um, those guns get dirty. They get hot. You're getting shot at, right? I would honestly be surprised if anyone at any point during the Civil War with a muzzle loading musket ever actually as an individual achieved 3 rounds a minute in combat with any kind of reliability whatsoever.
yeah,
And perhaps counterintuitively, you might not even want to. Average Civil War soldier, his cartridge box carries 40 rounds of ammunition. He can maybe shove another 20 to 40 rounds in the pockets of his uniform or haversack. So maybe on an edge case, a heavily loaded Civil War soldier might have 100, 120 rounds of ammunition on them. But even if we you assume, right, that man is firing really slow, right? He's loading and firing very deliberately. Every one of his shots is hitting home. Let's say he has 120 rounds of ammunition. Let's say he's shooting 1 round a minute, right, with extreme effectiveness. That only gets him to 2 hours of continuous combat,
right, right.
right? Um, the Battle of, there are on May 3rd at Chancellorsville, there are 5 hours of continuous combat where some units are again, going back to those third Wisconsin remarks where it's like they shot all the ammunition in their cartridge boxes, they shot all the ammunition in their haversacks, they had extra ammunition on mules that they brought with the regiment, they shot all of that ammunition as well. The reality is that um, while the firepower a Civil War soldier carries with him just as an individual just isn't that significant.
Right, right.
You add to that the general accuracy issues, the fact that I'll actually talk about here in a second, um, and the so Brett Nosworthy, who is the only guy I've seen who has even attempted to quantify in any kind of scientific way, wrote an excellent book that I recommend people read if they're interested in diving deeper into this kind of stuff called Bloody Crucible of Courage. Um, By his estimation, if you put a 500 man regiment versus another 500 man regiment, and I think his number was 175 yards or 150 yards, and all 500 men in one of those regiments aimed and fired all at once, for every 500 shots they fired, they'd produced 7 casualties.
Wow. That is staggeringly low for what you would assume it would be.
Staggeringly low. And so the the that rate of fire, right? 3 rounds a minute is useless to you if you're not hitting anything.
Oh,
Um, so not only was that rate of fire very rarely achieved during probably very rarely achieved, if ever achieved during the Civil War. Again, you literally, unless you are in panic mode, shooting at guys that are right in front of you, which to be fair was more common in the Civil War than many other conflicts, which I will also talk about here in a second. Um, it's maybe not even useful to you to
right,
fire that quickly.
right.
So I've said it in programs. Almost everybody I know who talks about Civil War musketry said it in programs. I still say it in programs because it is a thing you can do. It is a thing that Civil War soldiers talk about after the war. But I think kind of like what you did, it's important to couch that in this understanding that, like, okay, this is a theoretical max,
Yeah.
right? This is a man who has mastered the loading and firing drill, who knows exactly what he's doing, who wastes zero energy, who has perfectly efficient movements. Um, I think the fastest I've ever seen anybody do it is maybe getting gosh darn close to 4 rounds a minute. But
Well,
that's actually with infield style ammunition,
yeah, okay.
faster to load.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
And, and it's just it's so different if you're on the practice field and maybe you've got a sandwich riding on it or a piece of fresh cornbread, a little extra incentive, and so like that's just a much different environment than in that crucible of combat. I really love that title, Bloody Crucible of Courage.
yeah.
Yeah, wow, wow.
And so the
Okay.
last one,
Your
number
number, all
one.
right, so we're at number one now.
And this is I'm kind of cheating a little bit. There's kind of two in here. Well, there's one in here, and then sort of the sort of a lot of these combined sort of leads to my final point, which is um, we talk about the Civil War being so bloody and so lethal and having such high casualty rates. And often, and I remember like I can't tell you how many times I watched like History Channel documentary on the Civil War. And it said like the rifled musket is the reason the Civil War was so bloody. That this improvement in accuracy meant that men could kill other men with more efficiency than ever before in history. And it's one of those statements that is interesting because it's true, just not to the degree that is often
It's
assumed.
it's true, but yeah.
It's true technically, which to be fair is the best kind of true. My first 2 points were all about
Right.
being technically true in a way that is arguably from a standpoint of understanding the war not actually helpful or relevant. But this one and I'm kind of doing that in the opposite direction this time, where it's like yes, that statement is technically true, but not in the way you think it is. So the reality of the rifle musket, right? So actually here, let me grab one of my muskets. Okay. So this is a reproduction 1854 Lorenz rifled musket. It's the third most common musket of the war. And about 100,000 of these were imported and were used by both the U.S. and Confederate armies during the war from Austria. Its sights go out to 900, well, technically 900 Schritt, which is an Austrian equivalent of a yard. It's a couple inches shorter than a yard, but it's the same basic idea. 900 yards. Um, the problem is that at 900 yards, you're not shooting at someone anymore. You're dropping that bullet down on top of them out of the stratosphere. Civil War muskets fired very heavy bullets at very slow velocities by modern standards, right? It's like shooting a shotgun slug, rather than a modern rifle.
So when you talk about dropping it down out of the sky, I mean, you're really with that mechanism aiming above someone's head and counting on the trajectory of the bullet to take it where it needs to go.
Exactly. And when we talk about rifle muskets, the analogy that is most traditionally and commonly used is throwing a football. And I think that's also useful here to explain the trajectory. When you throw a football, you don't throw it level to the ground. It'll hit the ground 5 feet in front of you because gravity's pulling it down, right? When you see, you know, star quarterbacks throw, 30, 40, 50, 60 yards, right? They are lobbing that thing, probably a couple dozen yards in the air, right? At its
Right.
height. You're doing the same thing with these projectiles, right? These are, these types of bullets, they're basically a full ounce of lead. Some bullets are a little bit heavier, some bullets are a little bit lighter, but for all intents and purposes, they're right around an ounce of lead. Um, they're coming out of the barrels of those muzzles of those guns. The standard the US standard was 950 feet per second, which isn't even supersonic. It's below the speed of sound.
Mm.
So what that means is that it takes a shockingly long time for that bullet to actually get to your target, and gravity has a lot of time to pull it to the ground before
Right.
it gets there. Um, to As an example, right, I spent 7 years in the Army. I went out and did qualifications on my service rifle every year. Started out with M16s and ended up with M4s. But if you are on the range and a target pops up and it is 200 yards away, but you think it's the 100-yard target, and you aim at it like it's the 100-yard target, you will still hit it. You'll hit it a couple inches lower than where you were aiming, but you'll still hit it. You do that same thing with the rifle musket. That bullet's going to hit the ground 6 to 12 feet in front of your target. Um, and this conundrum was well understood to armies at the time. They created they define they created a definition called the dangerous space, which was the point of a bullet's flight where the trajectory brought it within the average height of a man. Um, and your dangerous space for us at different ranges might be as long as 100 yards or as shallow as 25 yards, depending on how far away you're shooting, which means that at distance, your margin for error is incredibly low.
Hmm.
And that meant that, as more than anything else, that in order to shoot one of these guns effectively at range, the soldier had to be incredibly good at estimating how far away the enemy was to a very, very small a degree of error.
Hmm.
And that took a lot of training. The When the Brits adopt the minie rifle in 1851 and then the 1853 infield rifle, which will become the standard. I've heard of the P-53 infield described as the AK-47 of the 1850s and 60s, where it's kind of the gold standard for a gun that just works
Yeah.
in the time frame, and that it kind of ends up in a lot of places that maybe it shouldn't have been. Um, but um, the Brits set up a musketry school at Hythe. That, if I remember right, the training for that was 4 months long to take an average man off the street and train him to effectively estimate range to the accuracy necessary to actually fire it at distance accurately. And that worked incredibly well. You get the famous thin red line, I believe at the Battle of Sevastopol during the Crimean War, where you have British infantrymen engaging Russian infantrymen at 6, 7, 800 yards with effective, accurate rifle fire. But it took an immense amount of training to get somebody there. And that training simply did not exist in the United States.
Hmm.
Um, it didn't exist in the U.S. Army. It didn't exist in the Confederate Army either. So that's another thing I'm wrapping up here is we very commonly hear it's like, oh, Southerners, they grew up in the woods and in the country and they grew up with a gun in their hands and they could shoot the wings off a fly at 100 yards. And with their hunting rifle back home, maybe, but they're not. But in, like you're hunting out here in the woods of Spotsylvania County, you're not shooting at anything more than 50 yards away. The sights on your hunting rifle are not adjustable. You don't need them to be adjustable. You're shooting probably a lighter, smaller weight bullet with a much heavier powder charge. So it's flying much faster. You get a lot less drop over the relatively short distances you're using it at. And of course, that also ignores the fact that most of the North was still rural as well.
Everyone always, oh
A
yeah.
lot of Northerners grew up hunting to put food in their plates as well. But I remember one of the things I was told when I joined the army and I went to basic training is that drill sergeants hated soldiers who had experience with guns before they joined
Yeah.
because they had learned a lot of bad habits that it was much harder to teach them to unlearn so they could shoot in combat effectively.
Right.
And I have no reason to believe that wouldn't be equally true in the
Yeah.
Civil War context. That shooting at a deer to put food on the table is a fundamentally different exercise than shooting at a human being who's shooting back at you,
Right.
especially at extended ranges. The simple reality is that the vast majority of Civil War soldiers could not hit the red side of a barn past about 200 yards
Mm.
because that's about the effective maximum range of a rifle musket if you never adjust the sights.
Okay. All right.
If you don't adjust the sights, you leave it at the 100-yard setting, which is usually what all these guns bottom out at, and you just shoot at a man's chest, depending on the gun and depending on the terrain, the gun you're using, and the ammunition you have, you can reasonably expect to hit somebody out to about 175 to 200 yards.
Mhm. And
Anything past that, your bullets are hitting the ground.
how much of this too is impacted by the sorts of formations that men are in, which of course changed between 1861, 1862, and 1864, 65, when there's a lot more defensive trench warfare and stuff like
Mhm.
that. So, like, I think that the formations probably have some sort of impact on that as well.
Yeah, well, so the formations during the Civil War are impacted by that. So for a couple of reasons. Um, the long, thin lines that people tend to look at as so stupid and so suicidal make a lot more sense when you remember when you know that the guy shooting at you is exponentially more likely to miss because he shoots high or low than because he missed you going left or right.
Hmm.
So if your line is wide, or sorry, it's long but very thin, you maximize and when you launch your attacks, you space those lines out by 50 or 75 yards. You maximize the chance that someone shooting at you is going to get the range wrong, and those bullets are going to land in front of you or behind you.
Yeah. See, and
Um,
again, something a lot of people ask is like, oh gosh, they were so stupid lining up in those big lines. But gosh, out of 500 of us, only 14 or only seven of us are apt to get shot. Like
right. And
the
so
odds are pretty good for you.
and that's and that probably is part of the reason why Civil War officers, as the war goes on, tend to I mean, even relatively early in the war, Fredericksburg is another good example. The Confederate infantry at the base of Marye's Heights are specifically told not to fire until the U.S. troops are inside about 200 yards. And that's because they're trying to maximize the effectiveness of their fire. Of course, they have the advantage of the Confederate artillery doing all the long range work for them. Um, but it's also because they're, at least in part, because they're trying to maximize, or at least a lot of Civil War officers try to maximize the number of casualties that they can generate instantaneously on the enemy to maximize the shock value of the fire. And you see that reflected in the way that Civil War soldiers were trained to fire their muskets. Um, in the British system, in the British Manual of Arms, the order was not ready, aim, fire. The order was present.
Mm,
And on the order of present, the man shouldered his musket, picked his target, and had 3 seconds to fire on his own time so that he could maximize the accuracy of his fire.
yeah.
The US system is much more influenced by the French system, which is you fire on command, everyone in the regiment fires simultaneously so that you have the maximum number of simultaneous impacts, the maximum number of simultaneous casualties. You're trying to maximize the shock value of that volley. And the hope is that that shock value will drive the enemy.
Uh,
And so When you imagine that the U.S. is dealing with a situation where the vast majority of their soldiers, North and South, can't accurately engage past about 200 yards, emphasizing the impact, the shock of your volleys makes I would argue, a fair amount of sense.
Yeah.
Um, which I also argue is why the French did it, right? Because the French are building their system around an understanding that they are dealing with a conscript army,
Right.
that if they ever find themselves in war, yeah, they'll have a regular army base of well trained, well drilled men. But in the case of war, they're dealing with a conscript army are pulling guys off the streets. They will have limited time to train them, and so they need a system that will be that they can where that will be effective with men with a relatively small amount of training, which is the same situation both the U.S.
Yeah.
and the Confederacy finds themselves in. They find themselves in a situation now. The vast majority of the soldiers on both sides are volunteers, not conscripts. But the same basic concept applies is that these are guys who are coming in off the streets, who are farmers, who are mechanics, who are accountants, who are lawyers, who, even who maybe never have picked up a rifle in their life. If they have picked up a rifle, they've certainly never shot at someone shooting back at them. They're not
Yeah.
used to being told what to do. Many of the volunteer regiments famously chafe at being told what to do, especially in the early years of the war. Um, and so a system that is designed around a conscript army is also one that makes it a lot of sense for a volunteer army.
Right. Right.
Um, so this idea that the Civil War was so bloody and so nasty, specifically because the rifled musket was so much more lethal of a weapon, ignores the fact that the average soldier hadn't actually gotten that much more lethal on an individual standpoint, and that even if his weapons had improved, the average Civil War soldier didn't have the training to use them to their full capacity. And even if he did, he spends a lot of his time fighting in environments where he can't fire that musket more than 50 or 100 or 200 yards anyway, right? You look at Spot Chancellorsville, you look at Wilderness, you look at Spotsylvania, you look at Shiloh, right? Battles that are happening deep in the country in either undeveloped rural forest areas, or in the case of the wilderness of Spotsylvania County, a nasty nonsense second growth forest.
Right. Right. Yeah, I think about that
Um,
with Chickamauga or the Vicksburg Inland Campaign with Grant. I mean, those are tough terrains that are not conducive to open field fighting at all.
which is part of the reason why you see some regiments, probably most famously the 69th New York, the famous Fighting Irish, who start the war with smoothbore muskets, who, when they're given those smoothbore muskets, assume they're getting the short end of the stick, who then later in the war, when they are given the opportunity to switch to rifled muskets, resist that switch
Yeah.
because the smoothbore musket is firing a heavier bullet at oftentimes a higher velocity than the rifled musket. So within its effective range, it might actually have a flatter trajectory. It might actually be easier to hit the enemy with at the ranges you're actually fighting at. And because of what we talked about earlier with how much smaller the bullets you're putting in that musket are, it's faster and easier to load in combat.
Wow. John, this has been a great discussion. I appreciate the chance to have you chat with me today. So, if folks want to learn more about this, you've recommended Bloody Courage of Crucible. Anything else you'd recommend
Bloody
to folks?
Crucible of Courage.
Bloody Crucible of Courage. Did I say
A
that
guy
right?
named Brett Nosworthy.
Yes, not as worthy. All right. Anything
Uh,
else?
see, uh, I mentioned um, Britt Gibbons.
Yep.
He has a couple of books that are really good. Particularly he has a book called The Destroying Angel, which is about the 18 the Minier rifle in British service, particularly in the Crimean War. And I think that book does a good way of describing how um, the how the British executed on their system. Earl Hess, Civil War Infantry Tactics,
Okay.
is another excellent read. So I would say Earl Hess, Civil War Infantry Tactics, and Brett Nosworthy's Bloody Crucible of Courage are kind of the gold standard on understanding the realities and limitations of Civil War combat, or at least 18th century combat or 19th century combat, specifically in the Civil War context.
Very good. John, thanks for being with us today. I appreciate it, man.
My pleasure.
So,
Thanks for
I'm
having
Chris
me.
Mikowski for the Emerging Civil War podcast. We'll see you online and on the battlefield.